This event is a virtual replica of our annual Swiss Young Leaders Reunion, normally held in Rüschlikon in person. And we had plans to feature Guy and Marie in a discussion in person in Rüschlikon last year, which was not possible. And unfortunately this year again, not possible, but we are so happy to have them here with us virtually. And with that, I'd like to give the word to Markus Diethelm, the wonderful chairman of the Swiss Advisory Council and co-chairman of the American Swiss Foundation. Markus.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and welcome to everyone. This is the 16th edition of the Young Leaders Reunion. I, of course, would have very much preferred to host all of you in Rüschlikon this Monday, right after the Swiss Advisory Council annual meeting. But of course, for reasons we all know, this is not possible. I can comfort you by saying it's a rainy day in Switzerland and there are other opportunities to be in Rüschlikon, which is a wonderful location. The second best, of course, to Rüschlikon is to do it virtually. This has the advantage that we have many more Americans to join to this program, and I'm going to be very short. So Friday, the 30th of April, marked the 100-day arbitrary marker, but we love to test people after 100 days. Of President Biden's tenure, and a first assessment will be made by Guy and Marie. Joe Biden spent his career developing a reputation as a bridge builder who could work across the aisle, a message he reinforced as a presidential candidate. But the Biden presidency has thus far been more about keeping the Democratic coalition together in an environment where bipartisanship seems unattainable. In this context, President Biden has taken a clear side, dare I say, in the long-standing debate in US politics on the role of government. The pandemic has given him an opportunity to show government can and should act boldly to improve people's lives and strengthen the nation. In fact, he said government should not be the problem, but it should be the means to combat the problem or the crisis. Now that, of course, reminds all of us who have a little bit a longer memory of history of 40 years ago when Ronald Reagan was sworn in. And he said in this actual crisis, and of course, America and the US economy suffered from an unrelenting period of inflation. He said in the actual crisis, government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem. And he introduced, of course, as we all know, the supply side economics with lower taxes and reducing regulations. Now, President Biden gives all indication with record spending that in the past would have been a clear indication for defeat in the midterm election, but because of record spending, because of all of that, but we're a long way away from that. And I'm going to be very curious and excited to hear both of you in the debate. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Certainly, I should say in the end, the American Swiss Foundation and its members cannot be happy about that certain speechwriter's input in President Biden's portraying Switzerland in his recent address to Congress. Branding it as a tax haven together with the Caymans and the Bahamas. That will be rectified later on, I hope. So this is perhaps also an opportunity, and it only demonstrates the continued importance of our organization since its founding of 75 years ago. As you will be aware, the pandemic prevented us from having the celebration, but I joined Patricia and Bob and all the leadership team that with optimism that by the end of the year that we can all be vaccinated and actually hold the Young Leaders Conference and the gala dinner in Zurich and one in New York. It's toward that goal that we work, and I got my first shot yesterday and have another one well ahead of the event. So with that, I pass it over to my dear friend and longstanding partner, Bob Giuffra, the co-chair of the American Swiss Foundation.
Thank you, Markus, for all you do. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing everyone as soon as we possibly can. This is a great topic to talk about. We have two of our most prominent young leaders of recent vintage, Guy Benson and Marie Harf. to be our speakers today. Guy is the political editor of Townhall.com and is a Fox News contributor. He is a nationally syndicated, someone who has been on many shows, very prominent. And Marie actually began her career at the CIA. She worked on the Obama re-election campaign and then became the deputy spokesperson for Secretary of State Kerry, and then became senior advisor to Secretary Kerry. And they both had a show on Fox News Radio together. So we're covering it on the right and on the left. As Markus mentioned, President Biden is at his 100-day mark, and we've had the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. He's done more executive orders than his three prior predecessors, including Donald Trump. He certainly does not tweet. He actually doesn't talk very much. And the old Joe Biden was someone who talked a lot. And as Markus mentioned, he promised bipartisanship and has largely governed toward his base. So, Marie, why don't I start with you? Have the first 100 days of the Biden administration been a success, failure, or is the jury still out?
Well, it is a little bit of an arbitrary date, but I think by most accounts, I would argue that it has been a success. Biden came in knowing that the top priority was COVID. It was getting shots in arms of Americans. They have beat every deadline they put in place to do that. Many more Americans are vaccinated today than they predicted. And it was to get the economy going again, put in place a plan to emerge economically from COVID. And the first spending bill was designed to help both individual Americans and small businesses get through the end of this pandemic, because we are probably on the 5 or 10 yard line, but we're not in the end zone quite yet. And so when you look at the numbers, more Americans today, according to a recent poll, are optimistic about the future than at any point since 2006. I think there is a sense that not having a president who tweets and who does a bunch of interviews and says a bunch of crazy things, and it's a little calmer politically, maybe, is what a lot of voters were looking for. They didn't like the chaos of the Trump administration. And while Republicans in Congress have not voted for President Biden's agenda, the numbers about how many Americans across the political spectrum support some of these proposals is quite telling. The White House is defining bipartisanship not as Republicans in Congress, but in how many of the American people, Democrats, independents, and even some Republicans, support things like the American Jobs Plan. And those numbers are all positive for them. And so they are making the case that we are doing better against COVID than anyone predicted in terms of vaccines. We have a plan to revitalize this economy, to get small businesses and Americans to the other side of the pandemic, and that their proposals are generally popular. So at the 100-day mark, I think they're probably feeling pretty good, but dangers lie ahead in the next 100 days. So I know we'll turn to that later, but that's sort of my top line take, Bob.
Guy, your perspective.
I take a less sanguine view, shockingly, of the Biden presidency so far. Although I would say it's probably too soon to really give a strong assessment of how this presidency is emerging. I would say that there are some positive signs. Marie mentioned some of them. I would quibble with a few of them, but the fact that they have really ramped up the vaccination effort is certainly a feather in their cap, although they were also handed 3 successful vaccines and 1 million shots a day clip from the previous administration. So this is really an amazing American achievement across party lines, which I think is something that we can all hopefully celebrate. I also would say that the first bill that was passed, $1.9 trillion on COVID relief, when you poll any of these proposals, they generally poll pretty well. $6 trillion of spending proposed in the first 100 days, which is just a staggering amount of money. When you poll the Republican version of these bills or the Republican counter proposal, they also poll extremely well. People want the government to help on infrastructure. They want the government to help on COVID. The question is, as always, the devil's in the details. How much do you want to spend? Where do you spend that money? And I do think that it is at least somewhat ironic that someone who ran as sort of a more moderate kind of Democrat, someone who said in his victory speech that he wanted to work across the aisle, and in fact, it was part of his mandate to work in a bipartisan way, saying this is what we have to do. We've done it in the past. It's a choice. I've done it. I know how to do it. This was a big part of his appeal. The first partisan COVID bill was passed and signed exclusively by the Democratic Party. All the other efforts on COVID relief were all overwhelmingly bipartisan. And the first major act of Biden was a very partisan vote on a bill that I think was wasteful. But I give him some credit, definitely on vaccines. He's got an approval rating in the low to mid 50s, which is not great historically for a president at this point in time, but we are in very polarized times. So I think that warps things a little bit. He's got a real problem at the border, or the border crisis that I think he primarily has caused. He's getting low marks on that, much higher marks on other issues. So I would say sort of a mixed bag so far for the new president.
Let's turn to COVID, the COVID effort. A year ago, approximately today, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of the state of New York, was riding high and was viewed as a potential, even presidential candidate in 2000. And Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who was, and Andrew Cuomo was basically preaching lockdown, lockdown, lockdown. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, has been preaching, open up, open up, open up, keep the beaches open, keep the economy open. And, a year later, it seems as if the DeSantis approach is viewed as the better approach toward COVID versus the Cuomo lockdown approach. What do you both think about that? Why don't we start, since I started? Guy, why don't you get the first word on this topic?
Well, I mean, the bloom is off the rose of Andrew Cuomo. It took quite a while for the media to catch up with what a lot of conservatives were saying involving his scandals, quite frankly, and maybe over in Switzerland they haven't been covered that much, but New York had one of the worst responses in the world, at least the worst outcomes in the world to COVID, and Governor Cuomo has had all sorts of, setting aside the sexual harassment allegations, there's a nursing home death scandal, a huge cover-up, multi-million-dollar book deal during the cover-up. It's a very bad look. Ron DeSantis has been a bête noire of the media and Democrats. They've tried to attack him and criticize him on everything that he's done during COVID, but Florida's outcomes have actually been pretty good, kind of average, slightly above average. They made some very smart moves in terms of protecting vulnerable people, elderly people in particular down in Florida. Just empirically, the numbers are much better in Florida than they are in New York or New Jersey or some of these other places. They're roughly the same per capita on health outcomes as California, which took a very different approach, of course, to Florida. Florida's economic data much better than California's, but the health data is about in the same ballpark. So, some of it I think has to do with climate and seasonality, more so than partisanship. I think a lot of it was viewed through a partisan lens by political operatives and people in the media who had their own agendas. But I think that a lot of the initial conventional wisdom about what was right and what was smart and what was safe has been completely turned on its head. And I would say it's not been a great year plus for the CDC. That's not just under Joe Biden, but there were huge mistakes made in the Trump administration with the CDC. A lot of the guidance that we're getting nationally now has people scratching their heads, to put it politely. And I'm sort of just grateful that we have these vaccines. I'm single dosed as well. I've got one more coming up on Monday, and then I'll be fully in the clear. But I'm glad that we have these vaccines, because I feel like that, setting aside all the other squabbles and all the other points and counterpoints and attacks and counterattacks, I think that's our way out of this. And I think one of the key things is to get more Republicans to get vaccinated, and that's been something I've been working on.
Marie,
yeah,
and
the reason the vaccines matter so much is because it became clear pretty early on in this pandemic that Americans were not willing to do the things that we needed to do to stop the spread. Some were hard to do given how large our country is, given how every state sets its own regulations. But I don't think the actual question is lockdown versus not. This isn't like an on and off switch of a light. I think it's more of a dimmer. And places where masks were worn more, not lockdowns, but sort of masks and social distancing and doing things that protected your fellow citizens, they had lower numbers. And look, we have almost 600,000 dead Americans. No state did well here. And when it comes to the CDC guidelines, I think what was very hard, Bob, over the last year was when President Trump very early on sort of politicized mask wearing and very common sense things that could help protect fellow citizens, it became a partisan issue. You had Republican groups organizing mask burning events. I mean, this is what happened to sort of collective responsibility and trying to take care of each other. And I think the problem with the CDC is that this was a disease a year and a half ago none of us had ever heard of. And so Dr. Fauci and the CDC, as they learned more, updated their guidance. And oftentimes they were too slow, certainly, but they updated their guidance. And I think some partisans took that and said, look, they told us something wrong. They changed their mind. Well, yeah, that happens in epidemiology when you have a new disease. And so I agree with Guy, the vaccines, especially for America and for the whole world, are the way out of this. And you know, we've seen what's happening in India and other countries. We are doing very well in our country. I know Switzerland is a little bit behind, and hopefully we'll be catching up soon, but we need to think about the whole world. We have a lot of vaccine now being produced, and how do we help the rest of the world emerge from this? That's, I think, one of the next questions in the pandemic response. And Guy's right, Republicans need to take the vaccine, and I'm glad that he is taking a leading role on trying to get more of them to do so.
Okay, next question. The next 100 days of the Biden administration may well be consumed by his infrastructure plan, which is, I think, $2 trillion, and then he has another $2 trillion spending plan. The Senate is right now divided 50-50. The House is close. Who is the most important Joe in Washington? Is it Joe Manchin or is it Joe Biden? And what do you predict will happen over the next 100 to 200 days? Do you think that Joe Manchin will be concerned about his West Virginia constituents and maybe put the brakes on some of the spending? Or do you think that he will go along lockstep with the Democrats and we'll have $6 trillion of stimulus spending, which may result in inflation in the next year? So Marie, your turn.
Sure. Well, I think that there are a couple of senators that hold the keys here. One of them is Joe Manchin. Another is his colleague from West Virginia, Shelley Moore Capito. There are some Republicans more towards the middle who I think are interested in negotiating on infrastructure. And we will see if the Republicans put forward proposals that are real negotiating positions. You know, Mitch McConnell, the Republican Senate leader, said yesterday his number one goal is to stop the Biden agenda. That doesn't sound like someone ready to compromise either. And so Democrats will say, look, we want to work together, but there needs to be a negotiating partner on the other side. So I think that people like Joe Manchin, Shelley Moore Capito in the Senate will try to come to some agreement about possible lower numbers here. But what the Biden administration will say is, okay, what do you want to cut? Do you want to cut early childhood education? Do you want to cut pre-K? Do you want to cut a lot of the things in these bills, Bob, are, again, very popular and speak really to Americans who need help. And so whether the numbers get lowered in a negotiating process is definitely possible. And I think the Biden administration probably is prepared to negotiate over those numbers. But the key provisions, I think, they're going to say, okay, tell your constituents why you're cutting broadband, for example. That will be an interesting political fight to watch. Guy, I don't know what your thoughts are on it.
So, I mean, there was no negotiation on the COVID relief bill, almost $2 trillion. So I think that was sort of an initial failure, broken promise, partisanship. Fine, they had the votes, they got it done. On infrastructure, there actually is bipartisan support for some work on infrastructure. What the Republicans are arguing is the number that Biden's put out is crazy. They're redefining infrastructure the way they're redefining bipartisanship to sort of suit their political needs. The Republicans in the Senate have put out a counter proposal. I think it's 600 to 800 billion is sort of the range that we've heard about, with a lot of bipartisan proposals in there that deal with actual infrastructure as sort of traditionally envisioned by people. Roads, rail, bridges, tunnels, that kind of thing. And not broadly expanding the definition of infrastructure to mean sort of anything. And we've seen some Democrats tweeting, childcare is infrastructure. Everything is infrastructure. Sort of words become meaningless. So I think we've seen, definitely to your question, Bob, Joe Manchin has said, we're not doing this giant number. I'm concerned about this. I'm concerned about some of the pay-fors. I'm not willing to raise taxes quite this much. I think he's going to try to rein things in a little bit, get things a little bit closer to something approaching where the Republicans are, but there's still going to be a pretty significant gap there. And I think ultimately they'll go through some of the motions. They'll improve the bill, if you will, a little bit. But if they have the vote from the Democratic side and they can satisfy Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, they're going to get what they want, maybe through reconciliation. But then that's a complicated term. They can only do it twice in a year. It's all these parliamentary rules. But I think infrastructure, one way or another, probably gets done.
Okay, next question. Donald Trump was viewed by some as a radical president, and Joe Biden has proposed a commission to look at our Supreme Court and our judicial system. Some Democrats have proposed increasing the size of the Supreme Court by from 9 to 13, which I think is a radical and really a terrible idea. And I'm really actually shocked that more people on the left and the right have not come out against that concept. And there's also been a proposal to make DC a state, another issue that certainly raises constitutional questions. Guy, what is your reaction to those two proposals by the Democrats, given how closely divided the country is? I mean, those appear to be fairly radical changes in the fundamental structure of our government.
Well, the bad news is they are both terrible radical ideas. You're right. Packing the court was awful when FDR tried it, and it got slapped down. Some leading left-wing lights on the court currently and just in the recent past have rejected it as too radical. I think that would be an astonishing thing to happen. It's very unpopular with the American people. DC statehood, I think, would require a constitutional amendment. They'd have a big fight about that. I think the purpose of it, the people who want it, is just to give add 2 Democratic seats to the U.S. Senate. Adamantly opposed to that. However, the good news is, from my perspective, neither one of these things is going to happen during this Congress, at least, certainly. Joe Manchin has come out against both of those things. Kyrsten Sinema has planted her feet on the filibuster rules, which would prevent the Democrats from doing those things. So right now, I think it actually gives great fodder for Republicans to unify and sort of come up and rally together against the left when we look at the midterm elections coming up. But I think the likelihood of either of those things happening is extremely slim unless Democrats win significantly more seats in upcoming elections. And I think the GOP is going to work very hard to make sure that doesn't happen.
Marie, your response.
Sure. Well, I'll start with DC first. I mean, I'm sitting in DC as a DC resident, and I actually don't think it's fair that I don't have full representation in my government. I pay taxes, I'm a citizen. And if your argument is that you don't want DC to become a state because you will lose out politically because there will, be Democratic senators, of course, well, that's not actually a good representational argument. That's a political argument that you don't think you can compete here. And that's not a great actual argument, I think, when it comes to our democracy. So I agree with Guy that I don't think it will happen. But both the DC statehood issue, and look, I'm moving to Virginia in 2 weeks, in part because I don't have full representation here. And the argument the Republicans make that somehow residents
over there.
That's fine. I also like DC. But the argument that Republicans make that somehow residents of DC are, quote, not real Americans is also a really offensive one. And Tom Cotton has made it. Others have made it. When it comes to both this issue and the court issue, which I'll touch on briefly, look, I think we are in a moment in our country's history where we are trying to figure out how our government can be more representative of us, of the country writ large. I mean, it's a question about the Electoral College. It's a question about how districts are drawn and House districts, how our government can feel like it's representing us more. And I do not think, look, I'm not sure how I feel about adding seats to the Supreme Court. What I know is it's not good for our democracy that every time a Supreme Court seat turns over, it is political Armageddon, and that we wait for justices to die or retire to game out a political game. I don't actually think that's good for our democracy either. And so whether it's adding seats, whether it's putting term limits on Supreme Court justices so you know when there will be a new seat open, I'm not sure how I feel about those things, but I know that when we just wait for justices to die, and then it's this Armageddon process where it takes over everything and the political tactics are really insane. I don't think that's good for our democracy either. And so all of these things are part of a broader conversation about the fact that to many people, it does not feel like our government is representative of us, and that certain number of senators from states that represent a very small part of our population have an outsized impact. these are questions we should not be scared to talk about, and we shouldn't rush to do things. But there's, again, a reason the Constitution did not say how many Supreme Court justices we should have, because they knew we had to continue having a conversation about this. So they're tough issues.
The one point I would make about that is that really the politicization of the courts began in the nomination process with Judge Robert Bork. And the one thing is, the Democratic justices or liberal justices did lots of things in the 1960s during the Warren Court. And I don't recall the Republicans talking when they got control when Nixon won or even Reagan won about expanding the court. But let me move to another topic.
Well, but Bob, also Democrats today sit here seeing Merrick Garland refusing to be brought up for a vote and Amy Coney Barrett getting confirmed mere days before the election. So there's a lot of partisanship on both sides here. And I mean,
let me turn to another topic. Let me turn to another, because you only have about another 5 minutes to go.
I wanted to respond.
I know we can go on for hours. For the first, I'd say 60 or 70 or 80 days of his post-presidency, Donald Trump has largely played golf. My sense is that he's getting bored with playing golf and he's beginning to stir, and lots of news down in Mar-a-Lago. What do you expect Donald Trump to do in 2024? Do you think he will be the nominee for the Republicans, or do you expect someone else will be? I want to give you the first response.
I mean, I have long since given up trying to predict what Donald Trump is going to do or say about anything ever. I think that if he is around and wants to run for president in 2024, I think he would be a very strong, if not prohibitive, frontrunner for the Republican nomination in 2024. I think he would be a significant long shot in a general election. He's been that before. He's won. But I think that he really enjoys being relevant, top of mind, center of attention, and he has not really been those things recently. And so, he's starting a new blog or website, it sounds like. He's putting out statements and email blasts constantly. He's really been chirping a lot recently, leaning back into the big lie about the 2020 election, that it was stolen, that it was underhanded, that there was still things being investigated that can really have changed everything. He was attacking Mike Pence in a statement the other day, attacking Mitch McConnell in a statement the other day, attacking the number 3 Republican in the House. It looks like they're about to throw her overboard in the House for this reason. So, we had a riot, a deadly riot at the Capitol because of this lie. I think it's now almost becoming something of a litmus test to indulge the lie within the Republican Party, which I think is a very pernicious development for the party, for the Republic. And I think that for him, it's sort of a personal loyalty thing. Whether he will admit it or not, I think deep down he understands he just lost the election, but he wants to know how much he will be able to have his thumb on this party, even on something like this. And so far, the returns would suggest that he is still by far the most influential person in the Republican Party, for good in some cases and for ill in others.
I want to try to get 2 more questions, and then we get it. Marie, quick response to the Donald Trump question is, what do you expect him to do in 2024?
Well, I agree with Guy. I've given up predicting his behavior, Donald Trump's behavior. But look, Liz Cheney wrote in an op-ed, Liz Cheney is incredibly conservative. She voted with Donald Trump much more than the woman who will likely replace her in her House leadership role. And she said, look, the Republican Party has a decision to make. Are we the party of truth and conservative values, or are we the party that embraces the big lie, lies to our supporters, undermines the democratic process, and just fights culture wars, basically? And the party has a decision to make. And, the voters get a bunch of votes in that decision-making process. And so I think we will see leading into 2022, the party working out some of those questions, Bob, about what kind of party they want to be. But it looks like they're heading towards being the party of, fealty to one man, as Liz Cheney said, and kind of conservative principles be damned, and pushing this big lie and really undermining confidence in the system. The fact that 70% of Republican voters in a recent poll said Joe Biden was not elected president is a problem. And Donald Trump, thank God he's not on Twitter and can't continue pushing the big lie. It's amazing how much that's changed the conversation, but he's in charge. for worse, I think, for the party right now.
Let me turn to Switzerland, which was just so we have, I think we have about a minute or two left. I was sort of surprised, actually troubled, when President Biden in his recent speech to Congress, and these sort of statements get vetted by folks at the State Department, and they're not just made willy-nilly. And when he tried to, I thought it was actually tarring Switzerland, which is a great country, as a tax haven and sort of put it on the same footing as the Cayman Islands. I haven't been to the Cayman Islands. I have been to Bahamas, which was the other country that was referenced. And the Bahamas is certainly not the 6th largest direct investor in the United States and is not the #1 foreign investor for R&D in the United States. What do you think happened there? Do you think there was a mistake that was made by folks in the State Department, or that Joe Biden was basically relying on, ancient history or sort of unfair characterizations of Switzerland in making that statement to Congress? Marie, why don't you go first?
It's hard to know. You're right that these speeches are litigated down to every word. So, and I actually don't know what happened there. It's probably a sort of outdated caricature view that may not take full account of all of the sort of improvements that have been made over the past years in this area in Switzerland. So I have no idea how it ended up there. There also have been some commentators pointing out that Joe Biden's home state of Delaware is among the loosest tax states in the country. People often put businesses there for that reason. So it's a good question. I don't know. What I do know is I will look forward to the Biden administration naming ambassadors to a number of countries, including, of course, Switzerland, because I think that having a robust diplomatic presence in countries helps prevent something like this from happening. And I think they're getting very close to naming some ambassadors, but I will look forward to that happening because they need a full diplomatic team in place for relationships exactly like this one.
Guy, quick response.
Yeah, it's sort of amazing. It's May, and we're still really seeing this foot dragging when it comes to ambassadors. I think that's a fair point from Marie. I would say, look, it's funny. That comment and the Switzerland point in this quasi-State of the Union address did not make even a ripple here in the U.S. It is, but it's a huge story over there. I think that if it had been Trump who had alienated an ally, I think it would probably be a bigger pickup here in the U.S. because it would be a way to knock Trump. Instead, this was a reckless statement by a Democratic president, and generally the press sort of likes to clean up after them. But they shouldn't have made that mistake for reasons, Bob, that you referenced. And hopefully they'll actually get diplomatic personnel in place, and similar mistakes, especially with allies, won't happen again. Especially as they're trying to make new deals, it seems like, with enemies. Maybe let's not insult our allies.
One last question, just to keep everybody, and very quick. Joe Biden has now announced that the U.S. is pulling out of Afghanistan. And he's obviously being tougher on Russia and maybe softer on China. What is your very quick 1-minute assessment, 30 seconds each, of the Joe Biden foreign policy? And why don't I start with you, Guy?
Far too early to tell. The Afghanistan promise has been made by the Obama administration, then the Trump administration, and again by the Biden administration. I have mixed feelings about it, but there's a lot of fatigue here in the U.S., I think, of that ongoing presence. I am concerned about softness on China. I'm not concerned about getting tougher on Russia. They deserve it. And I think it's reasonable to let this play out a little longer before giving him a grade on this very complicated front. So again, I'll close with the same thing that I opened with: mixed signals so far.
Marie?
Yeah, Bob, I think, look, it's 20 years after 9/11, and I think that the Biden administration is saying, okay, we had formulated our foreign policy and national security policy around the global war on terrorism for a long time, and it's time to develop a foreign policy of the future, whether that's global great power competition with Russia and China, two very different relationships, whether that's ending the war in Afghanistan, or whether that is focusing more on new and emerging threats in cyberspace, in places around the world that we hadn't focused on as much, trade. I think that's really important. And the other thing they've done on foreign policy is say foreign policy and domestic policy are very linked, whether, again, it's trade and tariffs, or when and how we send our young men and women overseas to fight in combat, to conflict zones. They have said very clearly that these things are linked. And so I think the Biden foreign policy has started by sort of putting out fires that the Trump administration had inflamed, whether it's fixing our refugee admissions or getting back in the Paris Climate Accords. So they started out by sort of having to take care of a bunch of urgent business, and now we will see them build on that in terms of revitalizing our alliances in Europe, which is a huge piece of business for them, ending the war in Afghanistan, rebalancing again more towards economic issues and trade issues. I think that we've seen some good and hopeful starts, and 100 days is a blink of an eye in foreign policy. So it's really too early to judge where this is all going. But so far, so good, in my opinion.
And just on all the topics we've talked about, I think from my perspective, I think the president promised to be more of a bipartisan leader. And I think a lot of these issues are issues where the answer is more in the middle. And I think that the sort of, Donald Trump bad, Biden good view, I think they're much more nuanced. The border is an example of that. Yep. I think the real lesson, which I always close on when I do this sort of a presentation, is I really admire the Swiss, where they really do work and try to find the middle ground and try to have approaches that have broad appeal. And I worry that we are too, on one side and then the other side, and we kind of are swinging back and forth. But that's enough. Tina, why don't you give us the closing? Thank you.
With the greatest of pleasure. Marie, you said with a blink of an eye, 100 days. Well, those were 35 minutes to try to wrap those up. A big, big, big thank you. Words of appreciation from all the young leaders, to you, Marie, to you, Guy, of course, to you, Bob, for this wonderful moderation. Thanks also to Markus for the introductory word. 100 days, you touched on a few absolutely key topics, and I can't resist to just pick a few of them up. Vaccination, clearly the number one topic, and being Swiss, I can just say how much it resonates. It's the number one issue that will get us all together back in Rüschlikon, obviously, and hopefully back on both sides, but also to get this economy going, these jobs going, to get both countries back on track. Bob, you asked about the scandal around Governor Cuomo. Maria can confirm this has been hitting the news as well, maybe not on every one of the days, but it's been discussed here. And of course, always interesting, because this discussion about whether lockdown or not is one that we've seen outside of the US and mainly in Switzerland as well. And I guess it will take many more 100 days to know which was the right medication to take on this one. You touched on the infrastructure plan, and I must say there, I picked up one element with worry, which is around what should be cut. And maybe here, just as a Swiss, and Bob alluded to it, that maybe the Swiss have the odd interest piece to look at. Well, please do not cut on education. Make this the last element that you will cut on. You need this country to have the right education and to invest in and upskilling, of course, as well. Institutional issues, always very interesting. And here I'll be very short. Well, yes, why don't you look at the Swiss model? Why don't you look at representation and how things could be done in, a more cohesive way, bringing everybody to the table? You talked about the next nominee of the Republicans. I'll be quick on this one. You talked about foreign policy. And then you talked about, and I think, Bob, everybody here on the Swiss side for sure will have been very happy to hear that question about, well, that statement of President Biden, indeed, where did this come from? In my view, we didn't get the answer. You talked about the political and the diplomatic representation. Well, we're definitely looking forward to seeing who the next ambassador of the US to Switzerland will be. We're, of course, very spoiled because the last one was Ed McMullen, a young leader himself. So we have high expectations on that one. I can only say that for us, in the coming not only 100, but many more days, we will be looking very closely at all the statements, and they will, yes, make big ripples, that, over here in Switzerland. So big thank you from my side on behalf again of the young leaders. Let me just use a last minute to draw your attention to the very few digital still moments that we have prepared for all of us to come together. The next one is very soon. It's on May 21st. We will have Kevin Conway, the biotech leader, moderated by me actually, followed by June 11th, where Manny Ryback will exchange insights with his classmate Neil Irwin, who is the senior economist or a senior economics correspondent of the New York Times. And finally, the last piece of our spring program will be on June 24, fourth way, we're honored to feature Congressman Bill Huizenga from Michigan for that last session. And with that, I can only say already tremendously looking forward to meeting in person. Till then, stay very safe and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.